Okay, well, good morning to the guests that I have with me. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening to all of our guests out there watching with us on our live recording here, whoever you may be and wherever you may be. Today we are hosting a 2-hour, 2-credit CE course for insurance professionals. This class is being filmed on Halloween Day, so happy Halloween to everybody. And again, I'm really glad that you could all make it here today, whether you're here in person or you're out there getting credits wherever you may be. So the topic we have for discussion today is a very fitting topic, if you ask me. Biohazard recovery and cleanup on this Halloween day. So, if our guests out there watching this in a video recording, please take your Oregon CE roster, fill it out properly, make sure your course number reflects 1019255, and that you filled it out properly with both your agent license number and the time in at 9 a.m., please. Moving on. My name is Shawn Lapof. I work here at Servpro of Salem West, here in Salem, Oregon. Been here for 3 years. I'm very proud to do what I do here at Servpro. I'm a marketing representative and PR in the community, but also our franchise strives very hard to cross-train everybody in all fields. So I have some first-hand knowledge with the topic that we're discussing today. The guests I have with me have already introduced themselves. If this is a live stream back at home, you can introduce yourself on the web. But let's move on. So, with the guests I have with me, attendance, you must attend the entire time. Those at home, you must watch the entire length of the video to gain the class credits. Classroom protocol is that we have bathrooms right down these stairs out here, and take note of both our emergency exits should you need. Those of you at home, if you're watching this in a group or a class, please, 1, take note of your restrooms, and 2, take note of your emergency exits. So let's take a look at the objectives of today's course. There's a lot of things I hope to impart upon you about this topic, and this is just kind of a broad overview of what I hope you walk away with today. And one being to be able to define a biohazard or a bloodborne pathogen. I'd like to ask if any of you at home maybe could define biohazard. You can just think about that, because we'll get into it. We're going to define regulated waste. We're going to describe safety steps to prevent exposure, because in the workplace we are monitored by OSHA, and a safe workplace is needed to be able to comply with this type of work. We're going to decide federal standards and regulations for applying to biohazard cleanup. These federal standards and regulations are how we develop these safety protocols, and we're going to explain certifications for this type of cleanup, as well as describing the characteristics of a good biohazard cleanup technician, describing the services provided. This is a service that's provided and it has value, and we're going to look at why that is, and understanding the nature of biohazard cleanup activities, because that service that adds value, it's got very clear nature to the things that we're trying to accomplish in these types of situations. So if we just take a bird's eye view really quick of what we're going to look at throughout the course, we're going to define biohazard. It's also known as crime scene cleanup in some cases. It's known as trauma scene cleanup in some cases. If we take a second and define biohazard, biohazard is a substance or situation that is hazardous to your health, or a biological entity. I am biological, and other biological things could present a biohazard, what's the word I'm looking for, threat to me, but it doesn't have to just be a chemical or blood or something that has happened. A biohazard could also be a situation. A situation can present a biohazard to me or you. So all that in trying to say that a biohazard could be a substance, but it could also be a situation. And these can also be combined. You could have a bloodborne pathogen situation that also has a fall hazard. And so these both are biohazardous to me, and they can be considered biohazard. But there's only one that really applies to cleaning in our industry here at Servpro, and that's biohazard materials that actually present a threat. So we're going to be taking a look at the cleaning procedures today that we use to mitigate and recover biohazard scenes. But a situation, a specific situation, can also present a biohazard to you. Obviously, the OSHA standards and regulations that apply to all this cleanup, and training and certifications that we go through, that others go through, and that are standardized and necessary. So again, introduction to biohazard cleanup. What is a biohazard? A biohazard is something or a situation that presents a hazard to me. Whether it's a respiratory hazard, or it's a skin contact hazard, or a sharps hazard. There's all sorts of different biohazardous situations that can present themselves if not properly identified or mitigated. Specialized skills are needed to be a biohazard technician or a recovery technician. And there's a really important skill in this that's needed. It's more important than all of them, if you ask me. We go right down the list with knowing how to work safely with the materials, knowing how to clean properly these materials, and knowing that this material needs this and that material needs that. But the most important skill needed for this type of work is definitely knowing how to respond to customers. Customers experiencing this type of situation, customers experiencing traumatic cases or trauma in their lives, whether it's family members, whether it's their own home, whether it's pets or the environment around them. Biohazards can present themselves in many ways. We are going to specifically look at the bloodborne pathogens section of biohazards today, but knowing how to interact with the customers that we come in contact with during these situations is one of the best qualities of a good biohazard technician. And that leads to having fortitude for the work. Not all cleaners can perform a trauma scene cleanup. Cleaners are required to work around human blood and dead bodies at some times. Cleanup can involve blood, cleaning blood off structures and contents, removing materials soaked with blood. It could also include working around severed or dismembered body parts. It can be very mentally taxing. If I recall, one of the biohazard scenes that I've been on throughout my career here at Servpro, just having the fortitude for the work, you try and prepare yourself the best you can, but you're not always prepared for what ends up showing up. I remember I was on scene once, and the thing I found myself unprepared for was just the immense amount of crying from an entire church congregation that had showed up at this scene in respect for the loss. And so you could just hear that the entire time on scene, just an immense amount of crying happening outside the scene. And I found myself recognizing that, and that it was tough it was taxing on the mind to have to deal with that. And so we made it through that situation, and it was a very sad situation, but that was something that I was unprepared for in that instance, but experience is always key in some of these cases. Biohazard technicians, companies like Servpro, here at Servpro of Salem West, companies that do biohazard cleanup, they're not required, employees of those companies are not required to do biohazard cleanup. An employer cannot force an employee to do biohazard cleanup. An employee has to be willing to do biohazard cleanup. An employee can make the designation whether he is willing to do biohazard or trauma scene cleanup before the work, during the work, or after the work. And so at any time, a biohazard technician can make the determination that I am not prepared for this, I do not have the stomach for this, I don't want to be here. And so finding the right technician to do this type of work is very key. Not only does he have to have the stomach, the fortitude for it, but he also has to be very customer-oriented. Empathetic is a word we use in this situation, but not overzealous. Customers rarely have a smile on their face when they call us, especially to deal with this topic. But moving on. Can anybody define a bloodborne pathogen for me? Just 1 second there. That's right, you're right. A bloodborne pathogen is an infectious agent in blood. So there's a lot of different things that can affect us. You know, there's carcinogens in this world, there's fungi in this world, there's mold in this world. All these things can affect our health. But a bloodborne pathogen is an infectious agent and found in blood. Bloodborne, and then pathogen, we can take the root word path. And so we know that this entity, whether it be a virus or a fungi, has to take the path of blood to a new host. So a bloodborne pathogen is an infectious agent, and that term infectious will come up later in comparison to some other things that we face in our society. These infectious agents, they cause disease. Hepatitis B and HIV are obviously the most common with dealing with this type of situation or this type of subject. Blood-borne illnesses are very vast, but the most common are hepatitis B and HIV. Workers exposed to bloodborne pathogens risk, of course, serious illness and death, which is why this type of work is both heavily regulated and very dangerous. Hepatitis V, HBV virus, contracting this can cause anorexia, malice, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, jaundice. Infected persons can have HBV in their blood, serum-like body fluids, saliva, semen. Infection can result in damage to the liver. That's the liver is taking the brunt of HBV when it comes to an infected individual. So if we take a look at a quick kind of back and forth here, it kind of illustrates the toxicity of the different fluids that you might find from a body concerning infectious HBV. So we can see over here on this high end that HBV, an individual that's contracted HBV is going to have high levels of the virus, both in their blood, their serum, their wound exudates. These are the high risk fluids as far as contracting or gaining that pathogen onto yourself. Obviously, there are other fluids that are more moderate with the infection, including vaginal fluids, semen, saliva, and then low, not detectable. We're talking about urine, feces, sweat. Now, this scale is largely accurate for HIV as well. HIV is slightly more present in things such as breast milk and semen. And so the scale is largely applicable to HIV as well. Talk about hepatitis for a second. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and hepatitis E are obviously the type of hepatitis that you might come across in an individual that you would want to be prepared for. But there's a rule of thumb, if you will. Hepatitis A and E, I remember that just by thinking of the TV network A&E. But hepatitis A and E can be contracted through these types of serums more readily than these types. Urine, feces, sweat, breast milk, whereas HBV and HBC are largely contracted through the blood, the serum, the pus. HBV prevention, though, there are steps to be taken to make sure that HBV is not contracted, especially in biohazard technicians, recovery technicians. There's an HBV vaccine. Now, vaccines are just that. They are a vaccination. They are preemptive. Vaccine is a preemptive step to not contracting the virus should you come in contact with it. Occupants at risk of acquiring HBV infection through exposure are obviously medical personnel, including dentists. Medical laboratory personnel is a designation of somebody who could come in contact with an HBV infectious material or bloodborne pathogen. Public service employees, it's probably rare in that case, but they are often there. Staff in institutions, classrooms for the mentally challenged, and of course biohazard cleaning technicians such as us here at Servpro. The vaccination for HBV must be made available by the employer to all employees who are designated to possibly have to work in a situation where HBV may be present. So in any company that provides biohazard recovery services, that employer must make available the HBV vaccine to all employees that will be performing the work at no cost, at a reasonable time and place, and performed by a licensed physician. HIV and AIDS. We all have some level of knowledge of this subject. HIV, human immune deficiency of virus, and as the virus grows within the body and gets to certain levels, it progresses onto HIV, or AIDS, excuse me, acquired immune deficiency virus, which is uncurable. HIV virus is transmitted by means of body fluids, especially blood and sexual secretions. You remember that with the scale that we went through. Preventing exposure. We've kind of talked on this a little bit with the HBV vaccine, but that only is a preventative measure for HBV. Preventing exposure is key to making our work as recovery technicians successful. Employers must train employees on how to protect themselves, and these safety procedures, outlined mainly in OSHA guidelines and standards, include universal precautions, engineering and work practice controls, housekeeping. I'm sure you guys have heard that word before, but we're going to learn how it applies to biohazard cleanup, personal protection equipment, and proper handling of regulated waste, which biohazardous material is. So has anybody ever heard the term universal precautions before? Think about it to yourself at home. Has anybody ever heard the term engineering work practice controls before? Engineering and work practice controls. Those are two separate things. I'm sure everybody's heard of housekeeping, but think about how it might apply to a situation such as this. Personal protection equipment. We use an acronym for personal protection equipment, PPE, which you will hear come up a couple more times in the presentation. That's what that means. We're referring to equipment that protects my person. It doesn't do very well to protecting anybody else but just mine. So some examples of that might be gloves, goggles, footwear, suits. These are all things that qualify as personal protective equipment, PPE. And then, of course, proper handling of regulated waste. Think about what that might entail, because we're going to get into it. So looking first at universal precautions. What does universal precautions mean? It means to always be cautious. That's pretty much what that term means. But applying it to biohazard recovery work means that if I'm approaching a biohazardous scene, I am not going to try and identify exactly what hazard is contained in that biohazardous substance. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to assume that this scene or this substance is hazardous to the highest level. If we're talking about blood or other types of body fluids, I'm not going to worry about what's in that blood or body fluids. I'm just going to assume, and HIV is the high end of that danger level, I'm just going to assume that this situation, that this blood, that this body fluid contains HIV to protect myself. Because if I assume, then I'm going to take the proper precautions. So universal precautions, we are always assuming the worst. If you cannot identify the type of fluid, consider all fluids to be potentially infectious. That applies to bodily fluids mixing with other fluids on scene. That can be hard to identify at sometimes, but should it even come into question, take universal precautions. Nobody wants an exposure and then having to worry about that after the fact. Should I go get tested? Yes. Should I go see a physician? Yes, of course, but you could have prevented the exposure. So universal precautions. Engineering controls. I asked you to think about what an engineering or a work practice control might be. An engineering control is a procedure that removes or eliminates hazards from the workplace. A procedure that places a barrier between the worker and the hazard. And obviously an example is a sharps object container. So, because I've placed a sharps container on scene of my biohazard cleanup, I have engineered a safer way to transport any sort of contaminated or not sharps, contaminated or not. I've engineered a way to properly transport those sharps without causing any more danger or cross-contamination to anyone else. So that is how I engineered that work practice for sharps. If we look closely at work practice controls after that, Work practice control is the way I actually perform the task. Performing a work procedure in a certain manner reduces the likelihood of an employee exposure. Engineering controls and decisions about the workplace conditions, work practice controls and decisions about how to perform tasks. So if we just take a step back at the previous slide here, we look at my sharps container on scene of a needle cleanup is an engineering control to contain these sharps. A work practice control in the same situation would be to never place my hand inside the container as I put sharps into it. If you can imagine me sticking my hand all the way inside, that's a bad work practice control. Whereas if I have the little foot tab and I open it and I drop it in there from above, that is a good work practice control. You're not sticking your hand into something that could possibly puncture. So that's just me trying to illustrate the difference between a work practice control and an engineering control. Obviously, hand washing facilities need to be provided in these types of situations, both for potential exposures and for just decontamination. We use PPE, personal protective equipment, to protect ourselves, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't decontaminate ourselves after we've been on scene and after we've removed our PPE. And even in the case of an exposure, being able to clean is the key, because not everybody thinks disinfectant's most important, but yes, you do have to disinfect, but you can't disinfect before you clean. So hand washing facilities are key. Should it be unfeasible to put hand washing facilities on a scene, antiseptic, hand cleaners, towelettes need to be provided. An employee needs to be able to clean himself during this work, or have the ability to, outside of the contaminated area. Work smart and stay safe. These are more work practice controls, and they're some of the most overlooked ones. No eating or drinking or smoking on this scene inside the contaminated area. Especially even outside the contaminated area, because if your technician isn't savvy about cross-contamination, then eating, drinking, smoking could be doing just that, cross-contaminating, exposing that individual, and creating a problem. Do not store food or drink or near blood or potentially infectious materials, customers' items or customers' food items, or consumables that are in the contaminated area or have been directly contaminated should be largely considered for disposal. And of course, minimize splashing, spraying, and splattering of blood or infectious materials. That's key, both with the chemicals or the products that we use, as well as with the actual substance that we may be dealing with, because often it is liquid. Blood does dry at a fast rate, but often we kind of run into it and it's in liquid form, and making sure that that stays contained, or containing it in the proper manner, is key. Being aware of sharp objects. Now, of course, hypodermic needles do themselves, a used hypodermic needle creates a biohazard in itself. One being that it could potentially contain blood-borne pathogens, and also just it being on the ground is a situation, with the needle cap off, is a situation that is a biohazard, because that needle could poke me, one, in the wrong spot and cause harm, and two, could expose me to a blood-borne pathogen that used needle could have come in contact with. So to minimize these, you minimize any chance a worker could be cut by sharp edges or struck by a needle. Use puncture-resistant, leak-proof containers. Those are those sharps containers we just looked at a couple slides back. They're puncture-resistant and they're leak-proof. That's key for sharps. Because transport, we have to take these things off scene, and we need to be able to do that. And of course, that's regulated waste. Workers should not have to put their hands in a container. What is that again? That's a work practice control. I'm practicing good work because I'm not sticking my hands into that container where other sharps are and could possibly poke me, cause an exposure. Label containers directed by the bloodborne pathogen standard. There are standards and guidelines about how bloodborne pathogens are stored and transported and disposed of. And that starts right at the scene. I can't put an infectious material into anything that isn't properly labeled. So I want to ask a question really quick to everybody who's out there watching as we look at this picture here. Maybe a little better for it, yeah. This particular biohazard technician is using, obviously he's got personal protective equipment on. Right there you can see he's got his glove to protect his hands. We can see the edge of a personal protective suit. And he's got duct tape to hold them together to make sure any liquids don't seep inside there. We can also see that he's got needle-nose pliers he's using to pick up a sharp. It's one of the largest exposure hazards on a biohazard scene that involves sharps, is picking them up. Picking them up is a huge exposure potential. So this particular individual is using needle-nose pliers and using them to grab the needle, the hypodermic needle by the needle, using the needle-nose pliers to grab the syringe by the needle. And so I want to ask, is using the needle-nose pliers a work practice control or an engineering control? I'll just let you all simmer on that at home. Housekeeping guidelines. The routine tasks that keep a work environment functioning. Of course, we all have our housekeeping guidelines we use in our home. Why do we do these things? Because it keeps our home or our place of work functioning properly. We need to function at a high level on a biohazard scene. We need to be able to operate without question and without risk. And so housekeeping is just as important as work practice controls or engineering controls or PPE. Housekeeping gets right down to it as well, because preparing a scene to be mitigated or recovered or disposed is just as important as actually doing the work. And so housekeeping, things such as clean and decontaminate equipment and surfaces, inspect decontaminant receptacles intended for reuse, using mechanical means to pick up broken glass, just like we saw with the needle, using a mechanical needle-nose pliers to pick them up, is good housekeeping guidelines, making sure you have a decontamination area separate from the contaminated area that the workers are going into and need to come back out of. These are very important housekeeping guidelines. So if we take a step back really quick to the pliers and the needle nose, this is actually one of the ones that straddles the line of work practice control and engineering control. He is showing good work practice by using the needle-nose pliers. The needle-nose pliers themselves can be considered a mechanical function in the workplace, providing safety, providing a means of safer disposal. So it could be considered an engineering control. I'm engineering a control to protect myself while picking this glass up, or I'm using good work practice controls by using these needle-nose pliers to pick this glass up. So it's one of the ones that straddles the line. It is a mechanical device that is used. It's an engineering control and a work practice control, and we see that in housekeeping guidelines as well. Using mechanical means to pick up broken glass, handle laundry with protective gloves. On a biohazard scene, it's very often that you need to figure out a way to properly dispose of or clean or recover all sorts of items. All sorts of different items can become contaminated by a biohazard, especially bloodborne. And sometimes it boils down to whether that's that particular item or surface or situation is a porous material or a non-porous material, whether it's dried, whether it's still pooled. All these things need to be considered when creating a plan that includes good housekeeping. Personal protective equipment, PPE, may prevent infectious organisms from contacting the employee, and that's why we use that's why we use PPE. We are trying to protect the entire individual, the entire worker that we've put on scene. We want zero chance of an exposure. We need to limit the exposure chance to as close to zero as possible. Obviously, being a company that provides this work, we are regulated by OSHA. We have standards that need to be adhered to and guidelines that we have to be aware of. PPE protects all possible routes of exposure. Work clothes, street shoes, undergarments, employee skin, eyes, mouth, or other mucous membranes. So if you don't have proper PPE on the scene of a biohazard cleanup, let's just say shoes, for example. Let's say we've got a technician cleaning a bloodborne pathogen on scene, and he hasn't covered the shoes that he's come to work in. And so that's fine. He might not experience an exposure right here on scene doing the work, but those shoes are going to track through what he's kind of trying to clean, very potentially, and those shoes are going to come back with him through the contaminated area, through the rest of whatever area he's in, back onto the truck that we sent him there in, back here to the shop that he came from, and then even more so back home to where he lives. He's going to be cross-contaminating all these areas, including his home, with what he stepped in prior. And if you have small children that play on your floor, tracking home what you went through at work isn't necessarily a good work practice control. So PPE has to be used properly. PPE has to be used every time. Employers ensure employees use proper PPE. And PPE can mean I need this here for this situation and I don't need it for this situation. I need to make sure I apply this PPE correctly. We're going to kind of get into that later about what are the steps taken to apply this PPE properly. Because if it's not applied properly, it's not going to do what it's meant to do. OSHA requirements for PPE. Employers, not employees, employers must perform a hazard assessment of the workplace. And this is a plan. This is every workplace, especially involving biohazard cleanup, is individual, is unique. So a plan must be created every time to address this unique situation. We have guidelines and standards that let us know how to go about this planning process, but the plan itself is going to be slightly different in any situation. And so performing that hazard assessment is key. There's obviously a hazard here when we're dealing with a bloodborne pathogen or biohazardous substance. There's obviously that hazard there. But an assessment needs to be made that other hazards do not exist. Above hazards, above fall hazards, tripping hazards, sharps hazards. All these different types of hazards need to be assessed prior to doing the work, prior to sending the employee to do the work. determine the PPE needed to protect against the identified hazard. So if I need a full bodysuit PPE to protect myself from the bloodborne pathogen, I may also need a hard hat to protect myself from a particular above fall hazard that can't be mitigated. Whereas that might not be needed in other cases. Employers must also provide PPE at no cost to the employees. An employee cannot be required to go provide his own PPE if he's willing to do the biohazard recovery work. Employees should remove PPE garments immediately or as soon as possible if penetrated by blood. I kind of alluded earlier to a decontamination area outside of the contaminated area, the cleaning scene, the biohazard scene. That should be properly set up, especially in case of an exposure. Should some sort of sharp or some other situation penetrate the PPE, the personal protective equipment of an employee, that employee now has to follow certain steps put in place defined by an exposure. And one of those is going to be to first decontaminate himself. And you can't do that without removing your PPE. So removing that PPE immediately or as soon as possible if penetrated, it's really nice to have a proper place to do that where you're not cross-contaminating one, the customer's home or contents or business, to other employees trying to help, the equipment we sent you with, or the truck that you need to go in, and then also definitely consider medical assistance if ever needed. Defining regulated waste. Regulated waste includes liquid or semi-liquid blood, contaminated items that release blood or potentially infectious liquid, items caked with blood, potentially infectious items capable of releasing materials caked with blood, contaminated sharps, and any waste containing blood or infectious materials. It's kind of a long-winded list to say that regulated waste is bloodborne pathogens or biohazard. If that type of liquid can't be identified, potentially infectious items still count as a biohazard. Or potentially infectious liquid. If you can't identify it, you have to use universal precautions, which, yes, means also that we're regulating that waste. Not us. It's the state that regulates. It's OSHA that regulates that how that waste needs to be disposed of. And we're going to look at how that waste is specifically disposed of as well later in the presentation. But the regulated waste itself, it's very feasible it needs to be controlled, because if we're transporting this waste that is potentially infectious to both us and others, it's a very high liability, and there needs to be steps taken and rules and guidelines and laws followed to dispose of that regulated waste. Can anybody at home, real quick while I shout out, can anybody maybe give me an example of what might be regulated waste? You can think about that. Besides blood. Dispose of infectious waste properly. Containers must be leak-proof. Place a first container into a second leak-proof container if necessary. Leak-proof is key when transporting or recovering biohazardous materials. And these containers or these leak-proof bags that are required that we use also must be properly labeled. Label containers as directed by the standard. Use red bags or specifically marked boxes and display the biohazard symbol. So that's pretty much it. OSHA standards regulate that all biohazardous regulated waste display the biohazard symbol as such. Now we also use these bags to bag regulated waste. We have large boxes that we put these bags in, and these boxes have lids, but yes, cardboard it does leak, and so it's not a leak-proof container. But the bag itself is considered leak-proof. These are very industrial bags that are provided to us through a vendor, through the state even, I believe. They are leak-proof. They are not puncture-resistant, but they do adhere to the standard of disposal. So implementing a safety program. This is something that's required by OSHA for all employers that are performing this work, that are having employees perform this work. OSHA standards for biohazard are applicable and do define that a safety program does have to be put in place by the employer concerning biohazardous materials, exposure, and determination of what an exposure is, who could possibly be exposed, all these things, as well as training. Training needs to be involved in this safety program, and we'll get into that as well. OSHA standards for biohazard, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, their standards or their federal code of regulations apply, in this case, in this topic, apply to both general industry and the construction industry. Those codes, 29, Title Code 29, CFR 1910 and 1926, I don't mean to fry your brain there with that, it's just that these code of federal regulations include standards. And the most applicable standards within these codes that apply to me cleaning a biohazard scene are the standards of personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, and bloodborne pathogens. This is literature on these subjects and how these things need to be addressed. Literature that is standard, standard regulated by OSHA, Federal Code of Regulations. And so these standards must be adhered to at all times by both the employer and the employee. We both know that OSHA can visit a workplace, both scheduled and announced or unannounced surprise inspection. This can happen both at the workplace or at the scene of the recovery, at the job site. OSHA is free to both schedule an inspection at your place of work or at the work site. There's a lot of different industries that have a brick and mortar building that they operate out of that OSHA is free to inspect for workplace hazards, as well as OSHA is free to inspect work sites, work that is being done outside of the point of operation for that business. Can anybody at home tell me if OSHA regulates a single homeowner from cleaning biohazardous materials? The answer is no. OSHA only regulates companies with employees. And so OSHA standards do not directly apply to individuals who come across biohazard scenes, whether this is just you cleaning a little bit of blood off a handrail because somebody cut their hand. That's not going to be, if you expose yourself, you haven't also broken any standards because you're just an individual. But if somebody is contracted to do this service, if a company is there to provide that service and that company has employees, they are regulated by OSHA and need to adhere to the standards to a T. Not just because inspections are scary, but because exposure is scary. Nobody wants to have to go through life because with HPV because they weren't safe enough on a job site. So, the first thing in these standards that include PPE, respiratory protection, and bloodborne pathogens, these standards illustrate that an employer must create an exposure control plan. This exposure control plan is kind of long-winded and it carries a lot of different parts, a lot of different things that need to be completed in this control plan to be able to provide it to OSHA. Employers must develop a written exposure control plan. The plan is a key requirement of the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard. Purpose is to eliminate or minimize employee exposure, and the plan is made available to both the employees and to OSHA. So OSHA can request your exposure control plan to be presented to them at any time. What is an exposure control plan? An exposure control plan illustrates for both the employer and the employee and OSHA examining that employer an exposure determination, a schedule and method for implementing the employer's bloodborne pathogen effort, we'll get into that, and procedure for evaluating exposure incidents, the procedure for an exposure. So if we look at the exposure determination, one of the first parts of a control plan. An exposure determination is the determination by the employer that these specific employees are at risk of being in the presence of a biohazard. Saying that means that these employees have a risk of exposure. So if I'm a biohazard technician and I've got an office manager who stays here in my office, my employer, Servpro, is going to say that I have a designation, that they have determined that I could possibly come into contact with biohazardous material, because they're going to send me to these job sites. I'm going to find myself on these job sites, whereas my office manager is left off this determination list. She is not trained in it. She will not be sent to the biohazard scenes. So I'm placed on that determination list. The individuals on that determination list have to adhere to the rest of the standards throughout the control plan. They have to be trained on both how to perform the work and how to adhere to the standards of the control plan should an exposure happen, should the employee have any concerns about how work is being done or what is being presented to them. So a list of job classifications, a list of job classifications where all employees have exposure in performing the job. A list of job classifications for which some employees have exposure in performing the job. And a list of tasks and procedures that involve exposure or potential for exposure. So that's your exposure determination. The employees and the job tasks that have the potential for exposure. The method for implementation. Document schedules and methods for implementing the bloodborne pathogen standards. It's long-winded for just documenting the employer's efforts for compliance with the standard Hepatitis B vaccines for employees need to be kept in this section. Records on that do need to be kept. As we stated earlier, an employer must provide the HPV vaccine at no cost to an employee who's willing to do this type of work. Evaluations and follow-ups for employees that have had an exposure, past instances need to be documented and saved, kept, and communication of hazards to employees. When we were talking back about determining the hazards or creating a plan on scene and identifying the hazards, identifying a hazard at the workplace does absolutely no good if it never gets communicated to anybody. And concerning biohazard recovery, biohazard cleanup, hazards that are identified need to be documented as well as communicated. The communications need to be documented. I am Shawn. I recognize that this is blood. We're going to use universal precautions and say that this is a hazard to everybody who comes into contact with it. I need to document, and my employer needs to document that I have communicated that. And record keeping. Post-exposure evaluation. So now we have an employee who has been exposed. There has to be a plan for that. God forbid, we never want it to happen. It's why we use our engineering controls. It's why we use our work practice controls. These are all standards in the OSHA requirements, and our PPE and our respiratory protection. These are standards and rules set forth by OSHA. Should an exposure happen, there has to be a plan in place. They report the incident to the person who maintains the records of exposure incidents, document the source of the individual's identification and status, consult applicable state and local laws regarding the disclosure and identification, offer the exposed employee the option of having his or her blood tested. It is still the employee's choice to have their blood tested. It is still a medical record and privy only to them, but needs to be provided by the employer should it be requested. After it's offered, and given appropriate counseling to the exposed employee. Even goes so far as to need a plan for counseling after the fact should an employee become exposed. Opinions of healthcare professionals. This is still in line with our post-exposure evaluation. We have an employee, he's been exposed, we have to walk through this plan now. Written opinions are obtained when employers receive both the hepatitis B vaccine. So this employee came to us. He said he was willing to do the work. We provided him with the HPV vaccine. And during that, the healthcare professional does provide a written opinion about your health and the administration of the HPV vaccine. It is not your medical record. It is still confidential to you, but also is provided to your employer. It is confidential under your employer's care, but is needed by them to determine that, one, you're fit to do the work, and two, to record that you have received the HPV vaccine to prevent contracting that should you ever be exposed. An employee that has an exposure incident, you're obviously going to get checked out by a medical professional. That medical professional is going to provide your employer with a written opinion about your exposure because of the nature of the work that the employer does. This is not your medical record. It is not doesn't necessarily list what you may have contracted during the exposure, but it is a written opinion of the healthcare professional that is provided post-exposure by the healthcare professional. The written opinions do state whether the hepatitis B vaccine is indicated, so it's documented that you've received the vaccine. The employee has received the vaccine. The rest of the result of the post-exposure evaluation, this is what's happened, this is possibly the results, and any medical conditions resulting from the exposure to the blood or other potentially infectious materials. It does include whether you've contracted, and these are confidential between your employer and you and your healthcare professional. But it is not your medical record. Training to employees. Training is part of the control plan. We're working through our employee-provided control plan, and training and documentation of that training to the employees needs to be maintained. Training must be provided at no cost, of course. At the time of the initial assessment, whether or not he's willing to do this type of work, whether or not he can do this type of work, and the training must be done during working hours. You cannot expect an employee to attend training or proceed with training by himself outside of work hours. Additional training at least once a year. Biohazard technicians need to continually be trained in continual refreshing of the topic and also development of new methods. A person conducting training must be knowledgeable about the subject matter, so it is required that the trainer have experience, not just experience, but training also. The training must be appropriate for the audience. This is a very touchy subject. Most of the pictures I have here in this presentation for you are very G-rated in most cases. But even for the training of our employees, there's no other way really to prepare them for what they might encounter on scene, because the training must be appropriate. Topics for employee training include bloodborne pathogen standard. It includes a lot of what we've talked about bloodborne pathogens, what they are, how they work, exposures, symptoms of disease. There are some pretty high risks, specific high risks. We talked about those with both HBV, HIV, HBC is possible, as well as other infectious viruses and bacteria. And so the symptoms of these need to be covered. Hepatitis B vaccination in itself is training. Ways bloodborne pathogens are transmitted. We covered that slightly with the scale of the risk of exposure with this type of bodily fluid, with this type of bodily fluid. An exposure control plan, the plan of you've actually been exposed, it's time to move forward from that now. That plan needs to be communicated to all employees. They need to know what to expect should they accidentally expose themselves, and the tasks that might result in the exposure. Yes. Topics for employee training: use and limitations of work practice and engineering controls. There are obviously limitations to all these things. A Sharps container, like we discussed, was puncture resistant and spill proof. These are both only to some extent. You could probably hit, if you ran over the puncture resistant containers, probably going to puncture. And if you've got nothing but liquid in a spill proof container, it still could possibly spill. There are limitations to these things, and they have to be examined. Personal protective equipment, these have limitations too. Obviously, puncture is one of the highest hazards that an employee faces. We have this personal protective equipment that protects my entire body, You could throw a bucket on me and nothing would get in, but should a needle or a piece of glass come into contact with my PPE, the limitations of it will let it proceed through and expose me. Emergency situations involving blood, reporting an exposure incident, and the post-exposure evaluation and follow-up. Employees should know what to expect as they move through the process of an exposure as an employee. And so just before we move on to training for employees, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. All you at home can take your phone calls if you need, make it quick, use the restroom if you need to now, and I'll see you back here in 10 minutes.